Tyrannies throughout history count on one thing: your submission. That is the #1 way by not stopping evil that you will let evil go on. So joining us later in the program to talk about that issue is author of Romans 13, The True Meaning of Government Submission, Timothy Baldwin. But we're dealing with submission to government and tyranny in other ways, in so many other ways tonight. And that includes massive deception, massive lies, and they just think the more they lie to you, the more they game you, the more they trick you, the more you're going to roll over and let them take over. With that in mind, Big Sis and DHS move on campus in a report from Kurt Nimmo talking about how more than 19 university and college heads from around the country have been tapped for the Homeland Security Advisory Council, which will seek to better recruit from campuses and preach emergency preparedness. The DHS insisted the new council is not about monitoring students and professors, but about making the academic community aware of their surroundings. Yeah, like we need government to tell us which way the sun rises, like we don't know what's going on. No, we got Kurt Haskell and other truth tellers all over this world, and we're watching that government. They're not going to watch us. They're not going to turn us into a Stasi network. Meanwhile, Eric Holder, the Attorney General himself, in plenty of scandal, is arguing that the U.S. can lawfully target American citizens. Of course, they had lawyers under Bush argue that torture is okay, even when it's children. Any decision to use lethal force against a U.S. citizen, even 1 in 10 on murdering Americans, who's become an operational leader of al-Qaeda in a foreign land, is among the gravest that government leaders can face. Although they'll be happy to take those powers from you, the American people can and deserve to be assured their actions taken in their defense are consistent with their values and laws, Holder said, as he argued for taking more and more and more and more rights away from us under the Bill of Rights and Constitution. They are trying to occupy our country, and they want to justify all kinds of violations as common practice, so you just forget about it. Now, in other news, this is a very interesting story. We know there's been lots and lots of war lies. Almost every 20th century United States war began with a false provocation. You could call it a false flag. You could call it a misunderstanding of communication. But all those ships blown up, the USS Maine, the Lusitania, Pearl Harbor, the phony Gulf of Tonkin incident, the lies about WMDs, all of them and more have been lies leading us into war. And we predictably have another big lie leading up to Syria. Now, this was not an outright false flag provocation, but it is a propaganda stunt, and they were this time at least caught quite blatantly as Syria Danny is caught staging CNN war propaganda stunt. The footage appears to show the activists coordinating fake gunfire. While waiting to be connected with CNN, Danny says, well, let the gunfire sound then, before subsequently asking someone off camera, did you tell him to get the gunfire ready? An explosion is heard after, but not before, and they've got him in this footage waiting for many minutes, I think up to an hour, waiting to be connected with CNN in an obviously quiet location. Then suddenly, when he's on with CNN, you hear what appears to be the sound of gunfire in the streets as he makes up lies about 200 people killed just in the last hour and literally begs for an Israeli or U.S.-led invasion into Syria, anything to stop them. Just totally caught in propaganda. Let's watch some of that footage right now.
جاهز الهدف اضرب لا اضرب طلع الكاميرا على الكاميرا.
And so he says, just let them shoot, and you begin to hear the gunfire and explosion. And then if you watch the rest of the report written by Paul Joseph Watson, you can see the full context of the clip as he goes on CNN and begins to provocate this big dramatic scene. Now, you've got all the other things in the Gulf War. Remember, you got that reporter in front of the fake palm trees pretending he's in a war zone. You've got the incubator babies hoax. put forward by the daughter or niece of a Kuwaiti ambassador. You've got fake video news releases, which are actually paid propaganda released as ordinary news. You've got cases like Fox makes Moscow protest with Athens clashes, faking Greece footage and saying it's happening in Russia. You've got lies about Pat Tillman and Jessica Lynch. So many things, the lies about bin Laden. Everything just has to be a fake lie to trick us, doesn't it? And I'm sure we'll fall for it again. In other news, U.S. think tank devises plan to sell fake Iran threat, admitting Iran is not a threat to either the U.S. or Israeli security, instead devising a narrative to sell unnecessary war to public. Now, this is actually old news that's still current news. Tony Cartalucci has done this report. He also did the reports more than 6 months ago, pointing out this 2009 Brookings Institute policy paper from 2009, which outlays a number of scenarios, not saying if there would be a war with Iran, but which way, when, how, why, what way to get there. Now let's look at the table of contents, because it's got all kinds of things on the table openly discussed in this long document, including disarming Tehran, the military options, going all the way with an invasion, the airstrike option, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. That's Chapter 5 and the focus of this article. You've got topping Tehran with regime change. One way to do it, they propose, is through a velvet revolution, through supporting a popular uprising. They've tried that in many ways, supporting an Iranian minority and opposition groups. They've tried to do that. The coup, supporting a military move against the regime. All this stuff you see happening throughout the Arab Spring, proposed here in the context of Iran in this 2009 document. And then you've got Tony Cartalucci redoing his analysis in terms of the current fake split where the U.S. and Obama are pretending they don't want to back an Israeli strike against Iran, saying, is it the right time? Should we let sanctions go through? But we've had Paul Craig Roberts and others on just pointing out what a fake split that really is, because of course they would back them. And they discuss in the Brookings Institute document, Which Path to Persia, whether or not it would be okay to have Israel do a unilateral strike against Iran, and pretty much going on to argue that it would backfire on the U.S. because everyone would assume they're working together anyway. So that's what you've got there. Another attempt to create false provocations towards war, and they openly do talk about it. We've covered some of those quotes before. So let's go more into the mind control. Let's go back in history and let's cover some details, some backdrop settings to how we got to this point. And that is through Urian Mason's article, Documents Reveal Rockefeller Foundation Actively Engaged in Mind Control. Mass mind control, that is. And Urian Mason has done a lot of great research. He takes the time to read through the Rockefeller Foundation's old reports. You should too. You're going to stumble across some real gold. And he reports here, in a series of generous grants in the 1940s and 50s extended to Professor Carl I. Hovland of Yale University, the foundation actively funded research into the psychological mechanisms through which communications exert their influence. Hovland himself held key positions on several major national boards, including the Air Force Human Resources Research Institute, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Office of Chief Staff of the U.S. Air Force, and doubtlessly had input in determining their research agendas. Among other things, he is quoted as saying, quote, "You do not have to cause pain to create fear. The human frontal cortex has a primary function in thinking about the future. We are quite skilled at imagining what might happen and experiencing anticipatory emotions. This has proved helpful in our evolution, but it can also cause problems, as anticipated fear of things that may not happen causes stress and others to persuade us." And this is the background research through psychology, through behavioral studies, through animal studies, to figure out how to game us, how to manipulate our emotions, to sell us lies that have a greater importance in the mass society they're trying to put together. They've been doing this in so many ways since the early 1800s. All the research from Hegel and the other psychologists Even the stuff from Jung and Freud, of course, Edward Bernays, being the cousin of Freud, used that research to exploit it in a mass commerce sense and in just general groupthink and brainwash. And so here's an actual quote from that 1954 Rockefeller Foundation document from Professor Hovland. Carl Hovland. With the aid of a new foundation grant, Professor Hovland and his associates plan to give attention to the psychological mechanisms through which communications exert their influence, how the individual deals with the welter of conflicting ideas with which he is constantly bombarded, how wishful thinking and emotional bias affect judgment, and whether the judgment process is transferred from one situation to another are among the problems to be studied. The foundation grant will provide core support for the long-range research program over a 10-year period. And he talks about all kinds of issues here, but among them, the sleeper cell idea that advertising or steered, controlled media speech will have an effect down the road in viewers, especially when they hear it repeated. We're talking about that Overton window concept. Love him or hate him, you got to give credit to Glenn Beck for bringing that out into the open with his book on the topic, because it is important. The Overton window discusses how to take a radical, unacceptable idea and gradually move it into the mainstream. If you take a look at this graphic, you move with a new idea from the unthinkable to the point of radical, to the point of acceptable, to the point of sensible in the mind's public. And by that point, you can get mass acceptance. And that is, in part, what's going on here. But again, they're tying in all the psychological studies on how to find man's breaking point, how to convince him of things, how to get past his logical and primitive mind and use that against him. They've been so sophisticated, and this is a deep area, but it's important just to talk about a few things. Now, more on Carl Hovland. Following Hovland's death, his attitude change program was characterized as the largest single contribution to the field of social communication any man has made. Over 30 years later, it was still deemed the biggest single force within psychology's communication relevant attitude change momentum. He was the gold standard for research in social psychology, according to Timothy Brock, a communications guy from the 90s. And it goes on from there. Now, I want to read just two more quotes from Lord Bertrand Russell, a key spokesman for the elite and a key visionary of the scientific dictatorship they were trying to unfold. This is from a Brent Jessup article in 2008, Behaviorism, Psychoanalysis, and Physiological Manipulation in Education. He says, in part, ordinary men and women will be expected to be docile, industrious, punctual, thoughtless, and contented. Of these qualities, probably contentment will be considered the most important. In order to produce it, all the researches of psychoanalysis, of behaviorism, and biochemistry will be brought into play. That was Bertrand Russell in 1931. Of course, the same one who says that through diet injections and injunctions, you'll be incapable of having independent thought or thought contrary to that of the state. Now, but they specifically have envisioned using television, using radio, using other types of mass media to brainwash us, to put forward these unacceptable ideas and make us learn to love our own servitude, as Aldous Huxley talked about. You see, his discussion of UNESCO's role, of course, Bertrand Russell worked closely with Sir Julian Huxley, the first head of UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Science, and Culture Organization. He said, I think the subject, which will be of most importance politically, is mass psychology. Its importance has been enormously increased by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. Of these, the most influential is what is called, quote, education. Religion plays a part, though a diminishing one. The press, the cinema, and the radio play an increasing part in propaganda, in mass psychology. They're going to use so-called education and the mass media to give us the ideas they want us to accept. It's that simple, but nobody ever seems to see through it. We buy into war after war, and it's just textbook stuff. They've studied how to game us. You got to take a look at this for yourself. I wish I could articulate it better. We turn now to the subject of hacking, the subject of cheetah robots, and the subject of literal speech jamming guns. Now, the first of those is a new bust that reveals that government runs the hacking groups. Of course they do. They run the antivirus software based on running the virus software. They run counterterrorism measures based on phony terrorists used to create a provocation. All they want is more power, and that's the way they sell these ideas. Now, Kurt Nimmo explains how the leader of Lulzsec has ratted out his hacktivist comrades with the establishment media, revealing further that government is responsible for creating and unleashing computer hacker groups. Monsekwur, a.k.a. Sabu, decided what targets to attack and who would participate in the attacks, more than likely at the direction of its FBI handlers. It's believed he participated in the anonymous effort to hack H.B. Gary, the security firm who works closely with the CIA, NSA, FBI, and Pentagon. You notice the CIA site's been hacked, not without coincidence. The Pentagon had to shut down its internet the other day, all so they can create this cybersecurity illusion that they have to have new powers, an internet kill switch, and so much more. Of course, that too is a big issue that we'll continue to cover. But DARPA has now been participating in research on a cheetah robot that can run faster than you. Right now, it's going some 18 miles an hour. They hope it could someday run 60 or 70 miles per hour. They've worked with Boston Dynamics, who have created other robots. And how nightmarish, how Terminator scenario is that, to be mauled by a robot cheetah when the government doesn't like something you're saying or doing? All this technology, just as Bertrand Russell, who we were just talking about, he said in his 1951 book, The Impact of Science on Society, that technology tends to enslave. Not because technology couldn't save us, that it can't have all these great new developments, but because these important foundations, like the Rockefeller Foundation, are steering the research and funding in the areas they want so they can use technology for control. Think about how textbook that is. As we look at this next story, Japan invents speech jamming gun that silences people mid-sentence. The device works by recording its target's speech, then firing the words back at them with a 0.2-second delay, which affects the brain's cognitive processes and causes speakers to stutter before silencing them completely. And whether or not this becomes widespread or widely accepted is a little bit beside the point. The point is they're applying research to areas of how to literally stop free speech. You've already seen all the riot control efforts, including new sophisticated shields that are supposed to choke people and keep them from being able to speak, not to mention just the general police state tactics to shut down free speech. It's this disgusting pursuit of high-tech ways to stifle free speech that really should be pretty frightening. Now, it is Super Tuesday. More than 10 states will be voting in the GOP primary. And we've got an article here in the AP Wire. Super Tuesday voters put importance on GOP race. And we've got a classic situation. After so much media blackout of Ron Paul, after efforts to demonize him, after saying the Iowa caucus wouldn't count if he won, after saying he's the only one other than Romney on the Virginia ballot, so nobody needs to pay attention to it. It's not interesting. We've got more of that telltale coverage that lets us know the system does not want Ron Paul in power. Mitt Romney is angling to solidify his frontrunner status, and Rick Santorum to keep it to a two-man race as voters in 10 states put Super Tuesday's imprint in the Republican presidential context. Newt Gingrich just hopes to keep his struggling campaign alive with a strong showing in Georgia. That's the Associated Press's lead article. It's not until, that's the first paragraph, it's not until paragraph 17 that Ron Paul is mentioned briefly in terms of being on the Virginia ballot, and not until paragraph 26 out of these 27 paragraphs where they say Rep. Ron Paul of Texas was focusing on today's caucuses in Alaska, Idaho, and North Dakota, and he is competitive in those three states. But again, his name can't be mentioned until the very bottom of the article. Go figure. However, you've got 6 Mitt Romney cousins all backing Ron Paul. No, this isn't about whether Ron Paul might possibly be considered for a VP slot if Romney ends up taking the nomination. No, this is members of the Romney family going out on their own to actually campaign for Ron Paul, including in Idaho, where, again, Ron Paul is competitive. They include Travis Romney, Troy Romney, Chad Romney, Jared Romney, and others. Won't read all names. Let's see. Travis Romney said in part, I support Ron Paul because he defends the Constitution, loves America, understands what it means to be an American, including the right to live your life any way you want as long as you respect others, said Travis Romney, a second cousin once removed from the former Massachusetts governor. And of course, Mitt Romney stands for none of that. But let's just see what happens here on Stupor Tuesday and how they continue to push Ron Paul out of acceptance, tell people he can't win as they cheat on the votes, as they obscure coverage to make sure he doesn't win. Well, you can't stop the effect he's having. This Ron Paul revolution is much bigger than just the phony vote, the charade we're put through year after year, cycle after cycle, choosing lesser of two evils. Well, they game us again and again, lie us into war again and again, lie to us, tell us our votes count for something when they count for nothing under this system unless we speak out against the real powers there. We're going to be back from break with Timothy Baldwin on the Romans 13, but we do ask that you consider subscribing to the PrisonPlanet.tv broadcast, this Infowars nightly news transmission that's made possible not from corporate grants, not from big dollars, but from individual supporters, from you out there. And if you don't support us monetarily, please spread the word about this broadcast. Send people the YouTube videos. If you don't send them all the videos, send them the ones you think are most important. If you don't like the way we say it, you say it. You get the message out there. We got to do something, just like the end of that famous movie, Soylent Green. Somehow, we got to stop him, somehow.
One is a serial hypocrite who lobbied for Freddie Mac before the housing crisis and for the individual mandate before Obamacare. Another, a counterfeit conservative who opposes right to work, massively increased spending, and funded Planned Parenthood. Finally, a flip-flopper who's been on all sides, supported TARP bailouts, and provided the blueprint for Obamacare. Three men, one vision. More big government, more mandates, less freedom. One man stands apart, ready to deliver real change, voting against every tax increase and every unbalanced budget every time. A real plan to cut $1 trillion year one and to balance the budget in 3. Pro-life, pro-liberty, guided by faith and principle. Ron Paul, the one who will restore America now.
I'm Ron Paul, and I approve this message.
Time to get out of the comfort zone because these people aren't playing games. 9/11 was an inside job. 9/11 was an inside job. 9/11 was an inside job.
We're going to organize. Humanity's going to come together. We are swinging muskets here, toe-to-toe with the globalists. They're bloodied. We're bloodied. It is absolute total war.
We are back from break on the Infowars Nightly News, and we turn now to our guest, Timothy Baldwin. He is the co-author, along with his father, Chuck Baldwin, of Romans 13, The True Meaning of Submission. And we turn to him now. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Good to be on your show today.
Good to have you on. So you've written this book, and it's really all about whether or not we're supposed to obey government and kind of passively sit by while the crimes of the state go on, or whether we're supposed to be thinking, conscious individuals who are trying to make a difference in this world.
That's right, Aaron. The book that my dad and I wrote addressed this issue that we hear so often today about the Christian's duty to submit to government no matter what. So we wrote this book in response to that, and because we see the first of all, it's a distortion of scriptures. Second of all, it's got such a detrimental effect on our society, and we're seeing the consequences of that today. It's time that we discuss this intelligently.
Right, and you've got tyrants throughout history. Hitler loved the Romans 13 passages. A lot of other people have misapplied it as well to construe greater government power in the 20th and 21st centuries, where we see massive state power all across the globe.
Well, I tell you, what's interesting, if you look to the history of the Romans 13 argument, of course, we see it throughout the Dark Ages. We see it whenever the monarchs of yesteryear would use Romans 13 to get their citizenry to submit to their evil and tyrannous ways. And that argument did not last in America when especially the colonial preachers began to teach on the true meaning of Romans 13. So from a period of about the 1600s and the 1700s, and even into the 1800s in the United States, this divine right of government argument really did not hold sway in the United States. But what's interesting is you see a revival of the Romans 13 submit no matter what argument whenever George Hegel, and of course, if you know your first, you know that George Hegel is the grandfather of communism. And ever since Hegel began to revive this idea, it's really been taking root in this country once again.
Yeah, Hegel really laid the groundwork for seeing the individual as just a cog of the state, and so many psychologists and other branches of government minions have ran with that. Now, I want to read a translation from Romans 13 between the King James Bible, which was supposedly a direct translation, versus other variations we've seen in the late 20th century. This one's from the Living Bible. But before I do that, isn't this also in part about what Jesus said in terms of render unto Caesar, which itself has been misconstrued and misinterpreted? In my reading, he really meant you either choose to be with the higher level, to be with God, or you choose to kind of live on that lower level under what the state can provide in that type of life. What is your interpretation?
Well, as you look through the entire scriptures, you will see that there is an element, that there is a jurisdiction that belongs to government, but there is a jurisdiction that doesn't belong to government. And we see this in Romans 13, this clear distinction between government that's good and government that's evil. In Romans 13, it describes the ordained government of God, which is what Jesus was referring to. The ordained government of God is not government that transcends its jurisdiction. That's why Jesus said, give unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but give unto God the things that are God's. And that's what Romans 13 says. It says God ordains government for the benefit of the citizens, for the benefit of man, to punish evil and to promote good.
Okay, I'm going to read now. I got this off the internet. I hope it's accurate. The King James Bible version, verse 1, Romans 13, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. And then here's the translation in the Living Bible, which this says as a paraphrase, obey the government, for God is the one who has put it there. There is no government anywhere that God has not placed in power. And then it goes on in verse 2, back in the King James, whosoever resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they shall receive to themselves damnation, versus those who refuse to obey the laws of the land are refusing to obey God, and punishment will follow.
Yeah, there is a clear distinction. If you compare the King James Version versus with the version you just read, the Living Bible version, there is an emphasis in the King James Version on authority that comes from God, and that authority is later described in Romans 13. We just mentioned it, but it's the authority of punishing evil and promoting good. The Living Bible translation focuses on the earthly authority. It focuses on man, and that is to say, whatever man decides to do, that's what we have to go along with, the law of the land. That's not what the King James Version or the original Greek meant. If you go into the Greek study of those words, and those words are used throughout the New Testament, you will see by comparison there was a limited implied throughout the scriptures when it uses that word submit. That same word is used when it describes relationships between husband and wives, between elders and other church members, between younger and older. So that same word is used throughout. And that word did not simply mean just obey no matter what. It means give due submission where submission is actually owed. Right.
And of course, people out there watching are thinking this is only a Christian argument. I don't think it is. I think you see this in the Renaissance and Enlightenment ages with a lot of humanitarian people, the humanitarian wing. You see it with the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson saying resistance is tyranny, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. Isn't this kind of a universal application as well?
It's a universal application. It's a natural law application. It's an application that's in both the Old and the New Testament. Aaron, if we look at the writer of Romans 13, it was the Apostle Paul. Paul wrote the book of Hebrews as well, Aaron. If we look at the book of Hebrews, we see that Paul uses some people in the Old Testament to demonstrate to us in the Christian era the demonstration of Christian faith. And he used people in the Old Testament who he described as subduing kingdoms and turning to flight the aliens or those foreign nations who were trying to oppress them. He said that they waxed valiant in fight. These were people that Paul used to demonstrate Christian faith or people who loved God. And they demonstrated their love for God by protecting their nation, by protecting their families. And that's what Paul said regarding the Christian faith.
And that's true. I mean, the whole Old Testament in many ways is this recurring cycle of the Hebrew people not obeying the, quote, higher powers of God, going with the stately or earthly regime and the wickedness and the depravity that follows over and over again throughout the Old Testament. Then in the New Testament, you see Paul, he's imprisoned and persecuted by government. He tries to escape them. He doesn't go along with government, even at times when he's a victim of the Roman Empire, of the empires of that era.
You know, not only did Paul not go along with, but he actually asserted his rights in the courts. He actually used the law against the government who was trying to accuse him and trying to prosecute him. He appealed to natural law. He appealed to Roman law. He appealed to law as a citizen. And so Paul never just blindly or sheepishly went along with government. The same could be said about Jesus. Many times they tried to kill Jesus. The government did. And those people in higher powers tried to kill Jesus. But he would not let them do it. He escaped them many times. And thus he deprived them of what he tried to do under the name of law.
I want to bring this point up. It's Henry David Thoreau. He was a transcendentalist. I don't really know if that's a compatible view, but he also said disobey an unjust government. Don't just go along with unjust laws. You have to be that resistance. And so I want to read in part from his civil disobedience essay. Thus, the state never intentionally confronts a man's senses, intellectual or moral, but only his body, his senses. It's not armed with superior wit or honesty, but with superior physical strength. I was not born to be forced. I will breathe after my own fashion. And that in part is what they mean by the state is not the higher power. Natural law, God is the higher power, not some measly state that can only oppress and suffer your own body. And so he says, when I meet a government which says to me, your money or your life, why should I be in haste to give it my money?
That's an excellent thought. And I think that great thing. You know, what's interesting is that, you know, these Christians will put so much priority on human law or human institution. And yet Jesus himself found occasion to deviate from the law of God, the law of Moses, which was considered much more sacred than any other human law that was ever instituted by man. And yet when it came to the Sabbath day, the holy day, you were supposed to prepare your meals before the Sabbath day so that you would not have to prepare any food for yourself and your family. And yet we see Jesus do Sabbath day where he picked corn from a field and he fed himself and the disciples. And when he was accused of violating the Sabbath, Jesus said, you know, there's a higher law than this. He said there is a higher natural law, and that law is not made to make men slaves, but yet the law is made so it could best and benefit mankind. And so Jesus gave us an illustration as it relates to even God's law itself.
That's right. We're not slaves. Now, turning back to the book you wrote with your father, Romans 13, your father has been a great patriot pastor, pursuing both what this country stands for and his religion and everything. You're following in his footsteps. But so many people in the American Revolution were patriot pastors. That's how it got started at Lexington and Concord. Isn't that the true spirit of freedom and of America? And why has this deception fallen on us regarding Romans 13?
Well, again, if you look at the history of Romans 13, we see in the Dark Ages this divine right of kings argument. That was the argument that was rejected by the Enlightenment philosophers, by the pastors in the Christian communities in America. And there was this very detailed exposition of Romans 13 in the churches of America during the 16 and 1700s. That was the message that the pastors used to equip their citizens to become educated as to what was the purpose of government, where are its boundaries, where are its limits, and what does God actually ordain in the Word of God. And so, absolutely, you're right. That's the argument that was the political understanding of the United States, and it carried on in this country for many, many years. And as we said before, it wasn't really until George Hegel came on the scene that this divine right of government argument really took seed once again in America. And we've seen the detrimental effects of it in the Christian community and in American politics ever since the mid-1800s.
Tim, today we have this domestic security force, Homeland Security, beginning to occupy more and more our country. The war machine rolls on. So many other problems at this point in time. Why is this book important now? What are you hoping people get out of it? And what is the overall takeaway message?
Well, first of all, we will not change really anything important in this country, politically or socially or in religion, until we start to really understand the true core or the true essence of our duties as Christians, or just simply as a man or as a woman. And one of those core issues is this idea of where is our limitations of submission to government, and what is the purpose of government? How do we even understand these things? If we can't wrap our minds around this core issue, then it's very unlikely that we're going to know how to act, how to think, and where to put our energies in as it relates to our response to these things. So Romans 13, the true meaning of submission, is a crucial element of restoring the ideas of liberty as understood by our founding generation, if we ever are again in this country.
Okay, Timothy Baldwin, thanks for joining us. And I just want to say in closing, we were put on this earth free. We were put on this earth with free will. Government is a resistance to that force. It is an evil, and rolling over to it, I agree, is not going to solve the issues we have.
No, we have to become educated, and I certainly hope that Romans 13, the true meaning of submission, will help enlighten the mind of a Christian or even a non-Christian. It doesn't matter, but we need to be able to equip ourselves with this particular argument, because it's used by politicians even to get Christians to lay down and do nothing.
So Romans 13 is at the Infowars store, and you can also find it, I'm sure, at Pastor Chuck Baldwin's website. Tell us where to find his and your work.
You can find the book on your site, as well as Romans13truth.com. You can also find my work at libertydefenseleague.com, and you can find Chuck Baldwin's work at chuckbaldwinlive.com.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll speak to you in the future. And that's it for tonight's Infowars Nightly News, but we leave you with the daily quote from the Magna Carta in 1215. To no one will we sell, to no one will we refuse or delay right or justice. And so that's from the Magna Carta, one of the founding documents of freedom as far as putting natural rights on paper and recognizing the individual. Signing off tonight for the Infowars Nightly News. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Aaron Dykes.